Hi, this is your buddy Quinn, and I'm here in this video to introduce a 2010 French-Canadian film called Incendies, directed by Denis Villeneuve. Incendies is a really powerful film. It caters to people who are interested in intercultural issues, but also will appeal to people who are fond of politics or fond of suspense and a thriller. It's about a pair of adult children of Arab heritage who live in Quebec. And they're instructed by their mother upon her death to deliver specific letters to their father and also to their brother. And this requires that they travel back to the land of their heritage, to the Middle East, in order to find those individuals. The movie is partly filmed in Canada and it's partly filmed in the Middle East. And so the dialogue in this film is about equal parts French and Arabic. The title of the movie, Incendies, means fire in French, but it's not the regular word for fire. So the regular word for fire is feu, but Incendies implies a large and potentially dangerous fire, maybe a conflagration. There are certainly some literal fires in this movie, as the title suggests, but the title also serves as a metaphor for some other things that are happening in the movie. Incendies can be a difficult movie to watch, and I wouldn't recommend this movie for young or for sensitive audiences. There's some disturbing war-related violence in the film, and there's also some abuse-related content. It's not a sexually explicit film, but it does have some difficult themes associated with it. Although it can be quite a difficult film to watch, it's also really powerful, and I think it generates a significant amount of suspense. So you may think of it in the genre of political thriller. It's a movie that demands quite a bit from the viewer, both intellectually and emotionally, and is the kind of movie that you can think about for many days afterward. Incendies can be rented to stream on a variety of services, including Amazon, YouTube, and other platforms. The movie runs 2 hours and 10 minutes. Because the Middle Eastern portions of the film are quite politicized, I need to talk a little bit about the context of the Lebanese Civil War. The Middle Eastern country in the film is actually never named, but from political history, it really could only be Lebanon. And Lebanon is a very small country geographically. It's about the size of Connecticut, but it has an enormous variety of religious groups and sects in Lebanon within a very small territory. It's also geographically diverse. It's on the Mediterranean coast, but it also has quite high mountains and valleys. It was carved out of Syria originally after World War I by the French when they were given a mandate over Syria by the League of Nations. And they carved Lebanon out of Syria for a specific purpose, and that was to generate a territory. Even though it's quite small, they wanted to create the biggest territory possible in which Christians would be the largest single religious group. And that's what they did. So Lebanon does have a long-standing Christian history associated with it, as well as Muslim history, both Sunni and Shiite. Lebanon erupted into civil war quite tragically in the mid-1970s. It was quite tragic because Beirut was often thought of as the Paris of the Middle East. It had a wonderful cafe culture. It had a lot of commercial success. Lebanon is not a country with oil, but it does have a strong education system. And by the mid-1970s, these inter-religious tensions had caught up with it. And over the next 15 years of the Lebanese Civil War, much of Lebanon is going to be physically destroyed, and relationships between groups will be certainly destroyed as well. Some of the reasons why it erupted into civil war include the following. So first, since 1945, when Lebanon was founded, the demographics had changed considerably. Muslims began to represent a much larger portion of the population than Christians, who were originally the largest single group at the formation of the state. But Christians since the beginning, since the 1940s, had really had a lock on some key political positions. They had a lock on a majority in the legislature, and they also controlled the presidency, which was the most powerful political office in Lebanon. And that really started to raise significant concerns about equity as the Muslim population grew and the Christian population started to comparatively shrink. Second, there were two big waves of Palestinian refugees that entered Lebanon. The first was after Israel declared independence in 1948. Many Palestinians were either forced out or fled, and some of them ended up in Lebanon. And then again, after Israel took over Palestinian territories in 1967. And both of these waves sent large numbers of primarily Muslim Palestinians into Lebanon. And that further altered the demographic balance. And so as a result, the Lebanese government was very keen to confine these Palestinian refugees into very highly controlled refugee camps. Their life was not very good in these camps. They had a very difficult time providing for themselves because they weren't, for the most part, allowed to work outside of the camps. Third, the armed group dedicated to the liberation of Palestine, known as the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, which was led by Yasser Arafat, was originally operating out of Jordan, but in 1970 in Jordan, the king of Jordan got into a big fight with the Palestinian Liberation Organization and essentially forced them to leave. And they left and went into Lebanon. So beginning in the early 1970s, you had a Palestinian guerrilla movement essentially operating out of Lebanon. And that made the dominantly Christian government extremely nervous. And so the PLO started to get into skirmishes with Christian militias, which really kicked off the war. And by the mid-1970s, the Lebanese army had essentially disintegrated, and there wasn't a national army to control violence per se, and religious groups had their own militias. They began to arm themselves. Often it was for their own protection. Christian groups had their own militias, Muslim groups had their own militias, both Sunni militias and then later Shia militias as well. And attacks by one militia against another would then be met by revenge attacks that ultimately started to degenerate into an accelerating cycle of violence, where it became quite difficult to know where the grievance originated. And civilians got caught in that violence. Lebanon's a small country. Militias are roaming around the country, and civilians were often, unfortunately, targeted because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time based on their religious identity. In Beirut, for example, Beirut essentially divided itself east and west. One side was Christian, one side was Muslim. There was a green line down the middle that was heavily patrolled by snipers. And it was exceptionally difficult to travel between one side or the other. So a formerly very, very diverse and intermingled population became very hostile and very separated during the course of the war. The Christian militias in this war did not act in very Christian ways. The most notorious of those militias was the Phalange, and it was inspired by fascist ideologies. And it was particularly notorious in terms of its attacks on civilian populations, particularly refugee camps where Palestinians were located. The war lasts 15 years, largely because outside powers couldn't stay out of it. Israel was involved for a significant portion of it. Syria was involved for a lot of it. Other countries, including countries as far as away as Iraq, were also involved. The United States was involved as well for a period of time. And eventually, by 1990, the combatants had essentially exhausted themselves and had exhausted the resources that they had at their disposal, and signed a peace deal in Taif, Saudi Arabia in 1990 that slightly altered the political relationship. It made the parliamentary representation between Christians and Muslims a little bit more equal, and also provided Muslim political positions like the prime minister or the speaker of parliament, gave them a little bit more power. But I would say overall, the Lebanese Civil War was a war that was deeply tragic, didn't need to happen, and didn't result in anything really positive coming out at the end of the day. Turning back to the film now, the Middle Eastern portions of the film were not shot in Lebanon. They were shot in Jordan, but they did a pretty good job of making it a believable context for the Lebanese Civil War. The play that kicked off this film was a 4-hour play written by a Canadian Lebanese playwright named Wajdi Muawad. And that the play itself took some inspiration from the life of a Lebanese political figure named Suha Bashara. Denis Villeneuve, the director of the film, saw this play, thought it was brilliant, decided he really wanted to do a screen adaptation, but started from scratch, didn't use any of the dialogue from the play. The play was 4 hours long. He wanted to get close to a 2-hour film. And so it took him about 5 years to actually write and ultimately get the blessing of the playwright as well. Even if you haven't seen Incendies, and this is, I think, one of those films that deserves a wider audience than it has received in the United States, you're certainly familiar with subsequent films made by the director, by Villeneuve. He's most famous for being the director of the science fiction film Arrival. He also directed the crime thriller Sicario and the science fiction film Blade Runner 2049. And he's been very prolific, making a bunch of great films over the past decade. Enough so that just last year, the Hollywood Critics Association awarded him the Filmmaker of the Decade award. Many of the actors in this film are Quebecois actors, so French-Canadian actors. Although arguably the most important role in the film, that of the character of Nawal, is played by a remarkable actress. She is a Moroccan, Spanish, Belgian actress named Lubna Azabal. If you've seen any Middle East film previously, she had an important role in an earlier Palestinian film called Paradise Now, and I think just does a really remarkable job in a very difficult role in Incendies. The film was made on a relatively small budget for a film of this type, $6 million, and made half of that back just in Quebecois theaters alone, and then went on to do really quite well internationally. I want to talk about a couple of things that make this film special. One thing that I really appreciate about this film is that it's very intellectually engaging. And it's in part a little difficult to follow because it has a nonlinear plot. Time bounces around a lot between present and past and between multiple periods in the past. And the past is largely centered around the Lebanese Civil War. The present is largely centered around the time that the film was made in 2010. And the point of view in this very time-shifting piece also changes quite a bit. So it shifts from character to character and demands your attention. In terms of cinematography, there are quite a few long panning shots that are quite slow. There's even some slow motion shots and a judicious use of music, including songs by the band Radiohead. The opening sequence in particular uses all of those elements, and I think it's particularly haunting and doesn't even really make sense until much later in the film. The cross-cultural engagement of a Lebanese Canadian family with their extended family background, language, history, the complexities that brings to a person's identity, I think are really relatable and are really socially interesting, particularly if you have a cross-cultural heritage or have immigrant background. I think that a lot of the difficulties that this family deals with in navigating that background will be interesting to you. I do think that this is a genuine intellectual thriller, and we get to go along with the Marwan family on a ride into their family history that will probably both excite you and may disturb you. The play and the film borrow some inspiration from Greek tragedy and the gradual revelation of information and its approach to plot development, which is a lot of fun. A couple of things to watch out for. I want to suggest two themes that this film does a really nice job with, and then two symbols to pay attention to throughout the film. The first theme is the question of where do you really come from? What don't we understand about our own families? What don't we understand about the choices that our parents made or our grandparents made that ultimately shape who we are today? Why should we care about that? And how do we go back in trying to understand some of the formative experiences in our family history? I think is a lovely theme of the film. A second one has to do with resilience and continuing to live and to try to thrive after experiencing significant trauma. War often brings really a great deal of trauma to people who didn't bargain for it. So how do we choose to live a fulfilling life in the presence of tragedy or in the presence of trauma? People have to find ways of dealing with it psychologically, and there's an exploration of that in this film, I think, as well. One symbol to pay attention to is the symbol of mathematics. So the daughter in this movie that we see very, very early on is a character named Jean Marwan, and she is a graduate student math instructor at the university. We see her leading her class in a mathematics lesson in which she introduces an equation to that class called the Collat's conjecture. The Collat's conjecture is a mathematical algorithm that produces the number 1 out of any positive integer. You just need to divide even numbers by 2 and multiply odd numbers by 3 and then add 1. And then just keep repeating and repeating, and eventually you'll get back to 1. That Collat's conjecture and the idea of solving mathematical equations, I think, provides an important symbol throughout the story. I think there's some tension in solving the riddle of her family, just as there is a tension in solving some of the riddles of what in the film is described as pure mathematics. A second symbol has to do with fire that comes out in the title. So I think that there's a lovely juxtaposition in this film between fire and water. So look out for that relationship. There's also a bit of a juxtaposition of heat and cold. We have Canada in cold months that seems very, very different and very far away from the Middle Eastern desert. And so that geographic juxtaposition of warmth and cold mirrors the fire and water symbols that we also see. Incendies is not for all audiences, but it really is made by a masterful director. And I think it's a really powerful film that is a masterwork in many respects. And it has the potential to affect you for a very long time after it. So I hope that you have a great experience with Incendies and that you'll enjoy the film.